Okay, so this is the last stop of the field trip. We're in a kind of green space between City Hall and Laurel Creek. City Hall is the building that we passed on our right on the way to this stop. And we see Laurel Creek that was kept on our left. And Laurel Creek has just emerged from under Uptown at this stop. So remember when we left stop 4 or just before stop 4, the creek came from Silver Lake and went under Uptown at Urban Caroline. This is the point at which it re-emerges from underneath the city. So I want to talk a little bit here about the water, about water management in the area and in the region. And I'll also talk a little bit about some more things that we can see at this stop too. So around 80% of our drinking water in Waterloo comes from groundwater. This is somewhat unusual in this part of Ontario, as much drinking water comes from surface water, in other words lakes and reservoirs, but almost 80% of our drinking water here comes from groundwater. Some of this water is obtained from well fields located in Uptown, Waterloo and Kitchener, urban areas with some 100 years of industrial history, which is important to think about in terms of water because of the various contaminants that can get into groundwater, as I'll discuss a little later at this stop. The stream, as we've mentioned before, is called Laurel Creek. It originates in the Waterloo Moraine and passes through the University of Waterloo. Some may know Laurel Creek Conservation Area, which was built for flood prevention in the 1960s. The actual headwaters of Laurel Creek are further upstream to the west of the conservation area. But what is a moraine? I said just now that Laurel Creek originates in Waterloo Moraine. A moraine is a landform that was created by a glacier or ice sheet through the deposition of materials that it carries. Glaciers deposit sediments at their terminus or front, their lateral margins and within the areas they occupied. But the terminal moraine forms the most significant landform. The Waterloo Moraine was created around 14 to 15,000 years ago, before the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered the Great Lakes area, finally retreated. It's particularly important because it was formed where 3 major glacial lobes meet. So 3 major glaciers were retreating from around this area at the same time. So their sediments joined in this area. And we'll talk a little more about glaciers, glaciation, and the landforms in this part of Ontario when we go to Elora too. So glacial sediments are made up to a large extent of sands, which are excellent at storing and releasing groundwater. These are the materials that are deposited at the terminus of the glacier that I just mentioned. And this forms what we also call an aquifer. So essentially a kind of sponge, essentially on a very, very large scale. The Waterloo Moraine is about 40 to 100 meters thick, and water within these aquifers moves up and down according to gravity and pressure. For example, from the more elevated Waterloo Moraine toward lower areas such as Waterloo and Kitchener, which is why it makes sense to have well fields down there. So these aquifers have extremely good permeability. As I mentioned, they're kind of like a very, very large sponge made up of sand and other sediments that water is able to kind of pass through, moving up and down according to gravity and pressure differentials. So because of their good permeability, aquifers are also vulnerable to the infiltration of contaminants from industrial areas. If water can leak into these sandy, spongy surfaces underground, so can other liquids, right? So thinking about this kind of industrial history helps us to understand how the aquifer has been managed and how it continues to be managed today. So what industries were historically important in Kitchener-Waterloo? We often think about KW as a startup space, a space for digital media and for technology. But actually manufacturing forms a large part of this area's history. If we look at some of the old industrial buildings along Victoria Street in Kitchener or King Street South in Waterloo, you'll find some of the names of historic industries. These include furniture production, felt, gloves, leather, leather tanneries, rubber, plastics manufacture, and chemicals manufacture. And also, of course, distilling, when we passed the Seagram's distillery earlier in the tour. So these kinds of older industrial buildings are really quite easy to spot. You'll see them all around Kitchener and Waterloo. If you take the train to Toronto, for example, there are huge abandoned former manufacturing buildings right behind the train station there that are really quite distinctive. If you take a look at the Google building in Kitchener too, you can see a very obviously new and modern part of that building, but also an older part that was previously a factory. So this is just more kind of evidence in the visual landscape of the industrial and manufacturing-based history of this area. But important for understanding water management, each of these industries included a kind of different mix of chemical substances, such as solvents, that may infiltrate the water if not handled properly. Some of the other things worth pointing out here, if you look across the creek, you'll see that we're close to the old train station that I mentioned previously. The second old train station, the other one being beside Waterloo Park. It's now a clothing store. Near here, with convenient access to coal being delivered by train, there used to be a coal gasification plant, which burned coal to produce gas for street lamps during the first half of the 20th century. The residues from coal gasification, coal tar, was deposited at the site where we now see City Hall as we walked to this final site. We also see in the kind of visual landscape military iconography in the area. The what's called a cenotaph, which is the tall memorial over the creek, the military vehicle to the left of that cenotaph, and so on. This kind of returns us to thinking critically about what is present in the visual field. How should we read the landscape in this space? Who or what is taking up public space? Why are these objects or memorials here and not somewhere else? Who is being remembered and perhaps grieved? And how are particular people and their stories prioritized in the landscape over others? That's kind of all I want to say at this stop. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this digital field trip has been engaging and interesting. And please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you so much.